Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the colloquium of the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Conditions. I'm Eli Salzberger, the director of the Minerva Center, and this meeting is part of a series of lectures, webinars that we are conducting, and some are related, as today's seminar, to our current crisis. Some other talk about other extreme conditions. We try to maintain our planned program, enhance it with some discussions on the current situation. And it's a pleasure today to have with us one of our principal investigators, Professor Gad Barzilai, the former Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Haifa and the former Vice Provost of the University of Haifa, who is both a legal scholar and a political scientist, who will talk about democracies amid legal emergencies, why models are limited, but some are useful. Gadi, the floor of yours. We'll have, of course, a question and answer session after your talk. Gadi, please.
Thanks very much, Eli. It's a pleasure. I mean, we are only online, but it's always a pleasure. And the topic that I've selected, it's a topic that I'm engaged in for not a few years. Actually, the beginning of my career began with that kind of a topic, and now, in a way, I'm refreshing it. And I would like, during my talk, to focus on a few models surrounding emergencies. And later on, I will explain what would be the focus of my argument regarding democracies amid legal emergencies, and my argument at the general level that models are limited, however, some are useful. So let me begin with a more kind of anecdotal issue, and I've selected 3 cases of emergencies. Obviously, it's not a conclusive list. One may add examples which are not mentioned, like maybe economic meltdown. And actually, the whole rationale of establishing Minerva a few years ago was that we would like, as a research center, to focus on several dimensions of emergencies. So the 3 examples which I selected have been obviously COVID-19, and I refer to it more largely momentarily, an earthquake. And we have several experts in Minerva dealing with earthquakes, and the issue of a ticking bomb, namely somebody who allegedly is suspicious of exploding herself or himself in a crowd, and this is always a nightmare of security services. Incidentally, my personal fear is that in the future we may witness cases of biological ticking bombs, namely of human-made viruses that are going to be disseminated by terrorists. Now, what is the common denominator of those 3 examples? And again, you could easily imagine other examples on top of COVID-19, earthquake, and a ticking bomb. So first of all, obviously, in all those 3 cases, we may expect some kind of suspension, and I will talk later on about the theory of legal suspension. And in all those cases, like many others, you know, we can build a grocery list kind of, we can expect a crisis of governability. But there is another common denominator that I will mention momentarily and will be the base of the rest of my talk today. But before we go to that point, I would like, first of all, to, obviously in a nutshell, to talk about legal certainty in legal jurisprudence and jurisprudential theories. And actually it begins since the 16th century with Descartes on to the 17th century, early beginning of 18th century with John Locke, and the whole concept of legal certainty is a fundamental in how we understand law. In research that we are doing about courts, about litigation, about commercial life, because, you know, in business or law of business, obviously certainty and legal certainty has always been captured as a pillar. And here you have a short quotations which I took from 1690 John Locke in his famous essay on human understanding. You see it on the slide. Judgment or assent to probability supplies our want of knowledge, the faculty which God has given man, namely also women obviously, to supply the want of clear and certain knowledge. And obviously the quest for legal certainty has been a fundamental in jurisprudence and legal theory, and another example would be obviously John Hart book 1961, The Concept of Law. Those who recall the classic book Concept of Law, Hart is actually doing an analogy between law and chess game, namely that you have certain rules, you play by the rules, and so forth. So just to cut a long story short, we have a long history of legal certainty in theory of jurisprudence and in jurisprudence by and large. And this is very different, by the way, from other disciplines, where, in fact, uncertainty has become a pillar of conceptualization, of conceptualizing realities. So take, for example, the famous 1927 of Hisenberg, the physicist, the German physicist, who talked about uncertainty as a major force, as a fundamental in modern physics. And for that rule, the rule of uncertainty, he got the Nobel Prize. Moving from physics and quantum physics, where uncertainty would be the beginning, actually, of understanding physics, moving to modern sociology, the German sociologist Ulrich Beck, talking about risk society. Actually, Beck was also editing a journal in German about risk society, and he published more than 150 articles about uncertainty as a fundamental in modern society. And actually Beck, in his book, which might be even a sort of a prophecy to what we are experiencing now, is talking about technology as a potentially distracting force. our inclination as humanity to abuse environment, and so forth. So one of his conclusions, we are talking about a risk society, and we are talking about uncertainty. And my argument is that the challenges to understand democracies amid emergencies, the challenge is how to digest, how to reconceptualize our legal understanding and our socio-political legal understanding of emergencies, taking into account that we are dealing with uncertainty, how it may affect parliaments, how it may affect litigation, how it may affect the judiciary. So this is a beginning of a paper where I would like to actually look into that question of legal jurisprudence and uncertainty, assuming that uncertainty will become integral to our life as private individuals and part of our life as legal scholars and as socio-legal scholars. So what I would like to do from this point onwards is to look into several models and try to understand how different concepts, and incidentally, I'm calling it a model. I'm not going into the convoluted issue of distinctions between paradigms, concept, theories, model. So just assume that a model for now is just a token. It's just kind of an expression. I'm not really arguing that each one of the concepts is a model of reality, but I do argue that each one of the models is an attempt to better conceptualize legality amid emergencies in democracies. Maybe one point more, I'm not going into definition of democracies because this is really another topic. So one can argue whether a specific nation is really a democratic nation or not, but I leave it aside and I assume that we are talking now about democracies. So the first model that I would like to explicate would be the model by Harold Lasswell, the garrison state model. It's based on a 1941 article published by Harold Lasswell, a law professor from Yale, that was very, very rich in his scientific contributions. And he called the 1941 article in the American Sociological Review, the garrison state model. And firstly, what has been the basic argument by Harold Lasswell? The main argument by Lasswell has been that in times of emergencies, in his 1941 essay, Lasswell mainly talked about a warfare condition. Let's call it belligerencies or any kind of security emergencies. He argued that in times of emergencies, military experts are taking over civil regulators, including courts. He didn't talk as much in his article about courts. Rather, he talked about the all civil authorities and civil regulators. And Lasswell's argument has been that gradually military experts are taking over. In fact, they are capturing the ability of civilians to supervise, to monitor, to regulate what's going on. So according to the Lasswellian model, in times of emergencies, gradually the whole process of legalization is going to be skewed and affected through the influence of military experts. And momentarily, I would like to extrapolate that kind of Lasswell point to the whole issue of emergencies and experts. Now, the main virtue of the Lasswellian model that he asks or invite us to look into a process of role expansion. Role expansion means that a certain elite of experts are actually, in a way, paralyzing democratic rule of law. They are capturing civilian regulators. They are capturing our ability to ensure transparency. So Lasswell has argued that in times of emergencies, and again, he primarily argued about warfare conditions. Don't forget 1941, it's the beginning, following Pearl Harbor, of the participation of the US in the Second World War. So the main virtue, what Lasswell is telling us, look what might happen in times of emergencies to the whole dynamics between experts and rule of law, experts and civilian regulators of a democratic society. The main limitation in the Lasswellian model, and I will refer to it later on, that he didn't talk about different regulators and different contingencies which may preserve democracy amid emergencies, and I'm going to talk about it later on today. But before we move ahead, let us expand. Let us do a sort of an exercise with the Lasswellian model and extrapolate from it on the whole issue of the future of democracies, legalities, and emergencies. So let's look at the COVID-19. And here we can talk, again, through the prism or the perspective of Lasswell, we can talk about the medicalization of pandemic crisis and silencing experts who are not medical doctors, who are not part of the medical establishment. So I think that one way to look into the role expansion during a pandemic, that actually gradually the medical arguments, right? And this is obviously somewhat reminds you of Foucault. The medical experts are taking over other regulatory agencies, other civilian regulatories who may challenge or oppose what the medical experts are saying. So what you see, for example, in Israel and gradually more and more in the United States are those conflicts between the, let's call it the economic expert elite and the medical expert elite. But this is exactly what Lasswell argued. We have to look into the sociology of role expansion in order to understand how legalities might be affected amid emergencies. And the second example is actually what Lasswell has talked about, the militarization of national security crisis. Lasswell basically told us in 1941, forgot about judicial review. It will not be very effective in times of a deep national security crisis. Similarly, one may argue that the effectiveness of the judiciary in times of a pandemic is also limited. Doesn't mean that it's not important. However, it still would be quite limited. So now I would like to move from Harold Lasswell to a second model. Now, for the first thought of time, actually the second model are two different models, but for the sake of time, I will collapse the third one into the second one. So basically, the two types of suspension model, and Professor Salzberger referred to it in his introductory lecture to Minerva. One suspension model is when a democracy is moving in a very sharp way from a democratic liberal model to an authoritarian military model, what sociologists are calling a Praetorian model, in a way which really may abuse human rights, but in democracies, hopefully, it would be only for a very short period of time. The other type of suspension model is that you don't really have a sharp movement from one legal model to another legal model, notwithstanding during the structure of the regular rule of law, you basically have suspension of different types of civil rights in order to allow medicalization of the crisis in the case of pandemic, or militarization of the crisis in a case of a national security crisis. Now, at a more generic level, the models of suspension are trying to move from uncertainty, from legal uncertainty, in a very sharp way to legal certainty. And this is how I offer to read Carl Schmitt. You know, the famous essay of Carl Schmitt from the 20th and 30th. So the way in which I offer to read Carl Schmitt is not how we read it heretofore, namely that liberal democracy has failed and now we have to move into suspension of liberal democracy. And obviously the very important notion of Carl Schmitt that you cannot really identify national sovereignty unless you define who may define an exceptional emergency regulation, right? This is a classic Carl Schmitt, but I think that Carl Schmitt is actually articulate despair of legal certainty in liberal democracies, and he would like us to move to another type of legal certainty, and this is legal certainty while declaring emergencies, defining others against the nation. You know, the classic Carl Schmitt as we all know it from the 20th and the 30s. One problem of Carl Schmitt is obviously what Erich Fromm was teaching us. Fromm, he was a psychiatrist, not a political philosopher or a legal philosopher, But Erich Fromm, from a perspective of psychiatry, showed us that actually moving to a spirit of exceptions and emergencies may legitimize fascism. Clinton Rossiter, the famous law professor from in upstate New York, from Cornell Law School. Clinton Rossiter from Cornell Law School in the early 50s is authoring one of the most important books ever on legal emergencies, showing that actually democracies may gradually collapse into authoritarian systems. Giorgio Agamben is actually the way in which I read Agamben. Agamben is offering a strong critical opposition to Carl Schmitt, using Erich Fromm, using Clinton Rossiter. Agamben was very much influenced by Clinton Rossiter. And what Agamben is saying, you know, uncertainty, legal uncertainty, is very ambivalent creature. Because on the one hand, and you know, Agamben in his classic book referred to Roman law. Later on, he has another essay from 2005 about legal emergencies. So what Agamben is arguing, be careful of not admitting legal uncertainties. Don't aspire to enforce law, to move into legal certainties, because if you do that, you would actually abuse human rights. So the suspension model is certainly very dangerous to democracies. And why it is dangerous to democracies, and here I would like to move to a third or fourth model, depends how you count it. And this is what I would call the expansion model of the nation state through law into society, using emergency legislation. And I think, by the way, that you could see it invariably now during the pandemic. You could see it in Spain, in Italy, in Israel, in the United States, in England, in France, where actually the nation state is using emergency regulations in order to invade civil society. And it is bound accordingly, to narrow down civil society. And it can be done through emergency legislation, as we are witnessing nowadays in Israel. I will talk later on momentarily about a judicial review. I will come to that point. And certainly you could see it in other countries. The whole process that scholars like Clinton Rossiter, Charles Tilly, the famous sociologist from Colombia, has explored. Now, judicial review would be very important, but judicial review in times of emergencies, and later on in the QA I can explain why more in detail, judicial review would have only a limited essence, and it can have only a limited value. So I wouldn't give up on judicial review. In the Israeli case, we have some, recently in the last 2-3 months, we have some important court rulings which are in a way taming emergencies. Notwithstanding, in times of a crisis, whether it's a crisis of medicalization or a crisis of militarization, by the way, it can be also combined, and I will talk about it later on, you would see a limited judicial review, somewhat important, notwithstanding, because we don't want to see a democracy which does not have a somewhat independent judicial review. So before I'm moving to the fourth or fifth model, let me summarize the state expansion model. So uncertainty is an important factor to unveil why review and accountability might be limited in times of legal emergencies. So legalities from a civilian democratic perspective are somewhat in danger. Using a bit of Foucault, uncertainty and emergencies increase disciplinary power. And you know, the disciplinary power, going back to Foucault, is intertwined with medicalization and militarization. And obviously what we see now at a global scale with different contingencies, what we see are obviously some restrictions on civil society, and I will talk about civil society momentarily. Now I would like to move on to the fifth or fourth model, and this is a model of legal adaptation. And national sovereignty and legal adaptation. And I would argue, not in detail because it's not the purpose of my talk today, I would argue that actually legal adaptation, like you see in Israel, not only in Israel, would be probably the best model under conditions of uncertainties. You know, obviously, during pandemic or a severe warfare or severe terrorist attacks or counter-terrorism, we are not on islands of egalitarian democracies, unfortunately. So I would like now to devote a few words and sentences about the model of legal adaptation, but also to talk about caveats of legal adaptation and contingencies of legal adaptation. So first of all, the legal adaptation model is arguing we shouldn't move hectically from, let's say, a liberal democracy into strict emergency regulations. In a way, we have to embed emergencies into our regular civilian structure, legal structure of civil rights, legal structure of human rights, legal structure of regulators, and I will talk later on briefly, obviously, about regulation. Now, that kind of a model would have prices, right? Because in a way, you are embedding the concept of emergency into your legal structure. And those of us who are well embedded in Israeli legal history could easily point also to some disadvantages. The advantages are, however, that once you are moving to a drastic condition of emergencies, you have more of a balance between the public interest of safety, let's say because of a terrorist event or pandemic, and tenets and principles of human rights and civil rights. However, the success of the model of adaptation, of legalistic adaptation, would depend on several contingencies, on several conditions. And because of time-wise calculation, I will do it briefly, but I will try to go over it. So first of all, judicial review. So judicial review is certainly very important, but we have quite a good research about the United States, about Israel, about India, in times of emergencies. And we know that judicial review may be quite timid and may ask for more and more jurisprudential balance between public interest and civil rights. The other issue, and you could see it recently in El Salvador, in the US, and in Israel, that the executive would more incline to legal evasion. Namely, the executive would incline more and more to say what the court was ruling, it's in a way unacceptable. And the reaction obviously might change from one country to another country. Notwithstanding, I would argue that the adaptation model is dependent on an independent judicial review, and that judicial review is important, certainly not an issue that I would suggest to give up on its importance. The second issue that was actually mentioned by Dr. Yoav Mechuzai last week is the issue of parliamentarian opposition, or as we see currently in the US, governor's opposition, right? Because it's a federal presidential system. But certainly parliament may have a voice. And actually in times of emergencies, one may argue that a split parliament is better than grand coalitions, big coalitions, because you need an opposition in times of emergencies. And this is an important issue to take into account. And the third issue that I would like to talk about is the issue of a better regulatory system. I think that if you look now into most Western democracies and into Israel, I will not go now into it, but Israel, it's not a classical Western liberal democracy, but for our purposes today, it's not as important. We in democracies or in states which aspire to be democracies, we don't have a good regulatory system as of yet. So if you take the Israeli case, for example, you don't really know who is controlling it. Is it the Ministry of Health? Is it the military? And I will talk about the military momentarily. Is it another regulator? Who is in charge? Now, what really happens, and quite similar in the United States, despite of FEMA and other organizations, that the politician, often a very ambitious, popular politician, will take over instead of professional regulatory systems who are becoming in charge of managing the whole crisis. Because like in a pandemic, it's not only a question of medicine. It's a question of science by and large. It's an economic question. You know, just recently, several Nobel Prize laureates in economics declared that we are facing the most severe recession after 1929. So we are facing, maybe not as bad, but we are certainly facing a severe economic crisis. But talking about Israel, we are facing a major socio-economic crisis with a severe deepening socio-economic stratification. So in that kind of a mess, you need a better regulatory system. And I think that Minerva is doing quite a lot in that direction of offering a better regulatory system. And this is a very important direction.
Gadi, may I ask you to conclude because we want to have some discussion?
Yeah. So 2 minutes more and
Sure.
I'm done. So actually it's the last slide and then just a brief summary. Now I would like briefly to talk about 3 other very important caveats, which we don't have a good literature about heretofore. Firstly, civil society. We can't just compare legal emergencies without taking into account NGOs' activities, civil protest, partly through litigation, and what I would call cyber resistance. You know, in most countries, you have limitations on demonstrations, right? Which is a severe restriction on liberties. But you have cyber resistance, which might be quite effective. Then we are talking about countries with very different types of legal cultures. And by the way, we don't have good literature about emergencies and legal cultures. There is an important essay by David Nelken, a friend and colleague from England, but we are missing good literature. And legal culture, it's very important because some cultures will give up on civil liberties quite easily. And other cultures would be more resistful of it. And last and not least, before I'm concluding, and this is very important, especially in countries with very strong army, like France, Israel, Turkey, and India. The military, once you have a lack of regulatory effectiveness, the military will insert the picture. The military, and in the case of Israel, maybe in other cases as well, also security services, will go into the picture more and more intensively. Yesterday, there was an amazing TV interview, before I'm concluding, with attorney Dvorah Chen. Dvorah Chen was the head of the security trials in the Attorney General office. And she argued that what is happening now in Israel is dangerous to civil democracy. Because, and she often represented in court the Israeli security services. She said it's not their job to look into our cell phone and to infringe on our privacy using emergency regulations. So she actually gave yesterday a very critical speech on the TV against using emergency regulations for minimizing or restricting our privacy. So the model of adaptation has also advantages and pitfalls. But the point that I would like to say, there is no perfect legal universe in times of emergencies. We have to become friendly with uncertainty. And we have to move from the traditional legal thinking about certainty into conceptualizing better. It was done before, obviously, but maybe to do it better and to conceptualize the whole issue of legal uncertainty. Now, last and not least, can international law help us? In a way. Obviously, we may expect in a Kantian fashion that international law will prevail with transnational values. It didn't happen in the current crisis, obviously. I think that national sovereignty won, and national sovereignty is leading the campaign, for better for worse, against pandemics. However, we have to bear in mind the gradual development of transnational values and potentialities in international law. Should be said, notwithstanding, that in many multilateral covenants in international law, national security gets a crucial place, and in a way, at least in some covenants, obviously not all of them, international law is allowing for suspension of some civil liberties in times of national security crisis. So last sentence for today, uncertainty amid legal emergencies in democratic system entail problematic socio-legal political challenges and some important ramifications. Models may offer democratic responses, but all models would offer only limited responses in different contingencies. Special attention, however, should be given to the conditions upon which the model of legal adaptation may realistically, not in a naive way, may realistically contain the damages for democracy and allow reconstruction following an urgent event, because we also have to think what will happen when a specific emergency is over. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Barzilai, for this grand tour of theories, of conceptualization of theories regarding democracies and emergencies. I will make maybe 2 or 3 points, small points, and then we'll open to remarks, comments from the panelists and from the general audience. One comment is the distinction between normative and positive analysis, which go through all these models. You started with the concept of uncertainty, saying that uncertainty will become much more important factor of science as we know it, and also of social sciences, including the law. And you said law was based on the concept of certainty. This is the ideal concept of law. Uncertainty in law as a positive analysis existed, and maybe it will be really enhanced. So I think a very important distinction should be made between positive and normative analysis throughout these theories. A second point concerns the distinction between uncertainty and rationality. And I think the worrying element of our global development in the past 2 years, which might be accelerated by this crisis, is not behavior under conditions of uncertainty, how to behave best under conditions of uncertainty, but the fact that many of us are not behaving or acting or voting rationally. And this begins with our belief in science. Some of the phenomena that we see in the US protesting against the curfew is out of a very disrespect or disbelief in scientific evidence. And of course, we can construct political models and governance models and various other things based on people's concept of rationality, and maybe more and more people are irrational, and this is reflected also by their elected governments. And the third point, I will be quick, is the distinction between preferences and expertise. Our behavior, our action, our decision-making is based on aggregation of expertise and on aggregation of preferences. Preferences are subjective, expertise are objective if we believe in science. And I think this shift between normality and an emergency or extreme condition merits a shift from preference aggregation, political decision-making to some kind of expert decision-making, as if we personally don't feel well, we go to the expert, the doctor, and we don't conduct a vote, a democratic vote. So do extreme conditions, which require a very, very quick response to great calamity, requires more experts. You said in some of the models it's the army, but it depends on the type of model. And I think you are very right with regard to the last model, the conceptualization of the last optimistic model, that what is very important is institutions and decision-making processes that here in Israel, unfortunately, we totally lack. And decision-making, and therefore not only not institutionalized, but are not trusted and are not really efficient professionally. Our decision-making reflects, in Israel specifically, reflects neither political will, because we have an undemocratic or government that doesn't represent the majority of people, nor it represents a really expertise decision-making, because we don't know who makes the decision, and there is no institutional and collective decision-making process orderly put by law. So I'll stop here, but thanks for this fascinating lecture. Do you want to collect some more questions and respond, or you want to respond to me, Gadi? It's your...
Eli, thanks very much. Those are excellent, excellent comments. And I will just say a few more sentences about each one of the comments, and then let's move to other comments. So first of all, I think that your point, Eli, about normative versus more empirical analysis is an excellent point. I was thinking about it, and the way in which I built was more analytical, namely in a way I blurred the distinctions between empiricism and normative perspective, and it would be very different. For example, Agamben is certainly very normative. Laswell has been in very analytical and empirical, so it's largely depends on to who are you referring to, but I certainly agree it's a very important point that maybe in a paper I have to put more emphasis on that distinction. I certainly agree. I think that in some democracies, and again, I'm not going into different distinction between democracies. As you point, there is a deep suspicion against science, and there is also a spirit of populism. And it makes the issue of dealing with the pandemic more problematic. However, I would also argue that often you don't have a strong regulatory system. I mean, it's not, if it's more clear who is giving commands, not necessarily the politician, it may soften that kind of a point. But thanks very much for excellent comments.
Rotem, you want?
Thanks. It was very interesting, and I learned a lot of new things. It's a small comment. You referred to Foucault in relation to some of these models, and you mentioned the expansion of disciplinary power. And I was wondering whether there's also a slightly different way of looking at it, whether this is truly the expansion of disciplinary power, or rather of what Foucault has termed security power, because I think that what we're seeing here is a type of power that doesn't look at the individual so much at disciplining in the individual, and looks more at society as a whole, at the need to control a very large society of people. And here also, I think that maybe another theory that's interesting to consider this aspect is Gilles Deleuze's theory of the control society, which is, I think, bears a little similarity, if I understand correctly, to Erlich Beck's risk society, even though I'm not sure. But it's really sort of an expansion on Foucault's idea of security, which he began to develop at a pretty late age of his career. And I think it sort of shows how this competing form of power also comes into play, even in medical crises, such as the coronavirus, when we see this sort of focus of society and the population as a whole. So it's just a thought, not arguing with the models per se, just sort of a thought on the theory behind
it. Okay, so thanks very much, Otem. I think it's a very insightful comment. I think that actually it's very much intertwined, because if we are looking at the pandemic, and closure would be apparently one of the most effective ways to deal with the pandemic, because we don't have a vaccine. The way in which you are imposing closure is using police forces and armed forces. But if you look at a country like Israel, and Israel, it's not the only one. I think that in France, it's quite the same. Again, countries with strong military forces, you may see more and more involvement in the military in quelling down the pandemic. Maybe it will not happen in this wave of the pandemic, because now we see declining numbers, at least in Israel, not in the US. But I think that going back to the theoretical level, it's often intertwined. It's not only medicalization of emergencies and its effectiveness on influencing arguments of judicial review, and it's not only national security, it's intertwined in a sense that actually we are talking about human security. So once human security is in danger, you may see, going back to Laswell, more role expansion of the military and more role expansion of the medical elite in order to capture a rule of law, and obviously it would have a price.
Thank you. And this was a comment by Dr. Rotem Rosenberg, who is a postdoc at the Minerva Center, Professor Amnon Reichman, who is a principal investigator and from the law faculty of the University of Haifa.
Thank you very much. I also have some conceptual questions. I think that one way, and this follows up both on what Rotem was saying and what Eli was saying before, one way to treat uncertainty as if it is a challenge to law. Another way to treat uncertainty is as if it is built into law, and then law tells us how to manage uncertainty. And actually what a crisis does in a liberal, in a non-liberal state, nothing really changes, because to the extent you have an authoritarian regime, and the authoritarian regime can be expert-based, Mandarin-like, or the authoritarian regime can be based on charisma or based on national identity or some other factors. But the true challenge, of course, is in a liberal culture where the individual matters. So what happens is that we have, and here's the first conceptual challenge, we have an operational myth, to use the known term, has been written about in the late 70s and before. We have an operational myth as if our doctrines sort of take into consideration risk and generate through an allocation of burdens of proofs and who has to show what. It allocates those risks among the various sectors, so that the individual, at the end of the day, the individual dignity or well-being is preserved. And what emergencies do is that, first of all, they show it as a myth. We don't really care so much about individuals anymore. So are we really liberal? That's the challenge. And also, we are not rational, and we're not necessarily rational with respect to the risk. Because if we were, because of the Song of the Siren, because if we were rational, it's unclear at all whether total curfew even helps. Because again, evidence suggests that you don't have to go all the way to total curfew. What matters is social distancing, and not necessarily total curfew, but you have to show to the people that you're doing something in order to just chill, we're on top of it. So that's the notion of operational myths, and the notion of a relationship between risk and individual, the risk and the duty to respect the individual as an entity, rather than just as a tool to generate the common good, or to protect the common good. The second point is this notion of institutional bias, which relates to your models that highlight institutionalism. So what we see again in emergencies is the heightened institutional bias. So if I'm in the Ministry of Health, I overvalue the risk. If I am in the economy, Minister of Finance, I overvalue the risk. Wherever I am, I tend to overvalue because of the sense of emergency. And then the notion of turning into expert doesn't really help. Why? Because the experts don't necessarily have a common language. So then the question is, do you do it politically? Do you throw it back to the political arena? And then what Eli said is, and therefore you have to have a running a political system where with all the checks and balances in between, or do you not? Do you just heighten the crisis by preferring some experts over others, and then you turn to physicists or mathematicians or something like that, as we're trying? It seems that it's happening in Israel, which doesn't make sense necessarily. That relates to the other part of the question is, you seem to suggest that there's only, under science, there's only one version of science, that if we only trust the expert, let's assume that these are medical experts, they will speak in one voice. But we know it's not true. We know that there's huge debates within the medical profession of how to, and again, what emergency does here, and this is unique about it, you silence debates. You silence professional debate, because there is a sense that you have to speak in one voice, and suddenly debate is threatening. How come experts disagree? If experts disagree, what will we do? The world will collapse. We have no certainty because of no certainty in science. And if there is one thing that I think we can take from your wonderful presentation, is how important it is not only to generate coalition and opposition in parliament, but also to maintain lively and robust challenging and debate within professional communities. I think that's part of the normative thing, the normative voice that I'm hearing from you, maybe. And the last thing I want to say, and that deals with democracy and distrust more generally. So some level of distrust is actually healthy. And the last thing I want to say is something that you haven't really talked about, and I think Laswell refers to this notion of garrison. That is the tension between the garrison mentality, which includes medicalization and securitization, in the sense that you take collective decisions to protect the many and you sacrifice the few, or you sacrifice some, is the notion of lack of transparency. Because as part of this notion of crisis is that there is a war on the perception. there is some kind of a struggle with respect to what is actually happening, what actually is happening on the ground. How many tests are you actually conducting? Are these tests actually accurate or not? All those facts. So some say, don't tell the public everything. The public need not to know everything. Now, there will be time for it later. But now let's just wall ourselves, surround ourselves with those protective mechanisms, which include inhibiting facts, inhibiting access to transparent disagreements about the facts. So I think that those elements also correspond with the models that you suggest.
Gadi, open your microphone.
It's open now. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Amnon. Those are excellent comments, and I agree to all of that. I just would like maybe to make a quick point. This is why at the outset of the lecture, I emphasize that in legal thinking and legal jurisprudence, much has been said about legal certainty. It really begins in the 16th century on to 17th century, epitomized itself in Hart books, the concept of law. So there is a strong tradition of legal certainty. However, as you are pointing, emergencies are actually challenging us to think through law from an alternative perspective, or at least a complementary perspective of emergencies. Second point about the fact that experts are in a way reflecting institutional affiliations, and I couldn't agree more, undoubtedly. This is why we need a better regulatory system. We need to know who is making the decisions, who are in a way accumulating or aggregating a different perspective. And last but not least, yes, referring to Laswell, we talked about the fact that medicalization is also silencing, at least potentially silencing, alternative expert groups. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Gadi and Amnon. And we have a question or comment from the audience. Sylvia, can you please present yourself?
Stern Sylvia, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem Department of History, and my advisors are at economics. I am postdoctoral student. I listened with great interest to the presentation and all contributions. There is one aspect which has been omitted, and in the situation of the current pandemics, we all, I believe, want to guard rationality and the evolution of individuality, and our institutions are designed to guard against uncertainty under the preservation of individual rights. However, in this particular pandemic, one of the problems is the restrictions on spatial mobility, and very severe restrictions. Those limit choice, and choice perforce limits rationality and also the individual scope for challenging every authority. And I'm not so certain that simply creating opposition will solve this issue. Now, why military and the scope for the military? We become dependent on non-pecuniary reward structures of people who can be ordered or are motivated to take risks without the immediate reward. That is, risks that cannot be paid, and here is the scope. Now, what could be a solution? This is to create counterbalances on the civilian side, on NGO organizations, religious organizations, secular ideological organizations that have the potential to lower the costs of collective action, to guard our institutions on one hand, and on the second hand, shoulder the non-pecuniary tasks of the military and become complementary. I don't think that simply to create a governmental opposition is the way to salvation under the current. Now, how to preserve the question of individuality under the conditions of rising risks. I'm not so sure that in this discussion we touched upon the crucial issue, the dependence upon medical expertise and so on. It cannot be overestimated because we don't know how many people may die. This is the crucial, maybe very few, maybe there will be a danger of mass graves. And this uncertainty could be, it is actually a dependence upon a progress in science, and a progress in science, there is some kind of a circular reason. It cannot, under those conditions, be fully pecuniary remunerated. So again, this is dependent upon non-pecuniary structures, and non-pecuniary structures, they can be generated through some kind of loyalty to the nation. We have been, that is the discussion of Professor Barzilai, has been to the dependence on international structures, right? But then do we have sufficient time to raise to the Darwinian notion of identifying with the mankind and so on? Did we reach this level of human evolution? Can we identify sufficiently with mankind, all of us, not in order to come ahead of the pandemic, or will it be too late? So my comment is solely the non-pecuniary incentive structures, how to generate those, because the patriotism can generate those structures amongst the scientists, among the military and the civilian NGO. What else could be generated in order to countervail the level of uncertainty, to preserve the dignity and the choice scope of the individuals?
Yeah, so that, thanks, Sylvia, very much. So recall that we talked about medicalization, referring to Laswell, and we later on mentioned Foucault about, and Rotem in her comments also talked about this kind of Foucault-like intertwined relations between the military complex and the medicalization. I do agree with you that we cannot in a way ignore the importance of science and medicine, but here I think that three issues should be taken into account. Firstly, once you don't have a clear regulatory structure, and as Amnon mentioned, different experts are reflecting different establishments. It's often a very convoluted setting. It's not clear who is giving orders. Secondly, the issue of judicial review. Judicial review is important. I'm certainly not naive about the effectiveness of judicial review. And as I mentioned, we have enough research to be relatively critical regarding the effectiveness of judicial review. But as long as the judiciary is fairly independent, it's a very important source of balancing. And I think that if you look at the Israeli court rulings in the last 3 months, there is a relatively good balance, maybe not an optimal one, between the public interest of public safety and human rights. Last and not least, I couldn't agree more. I mean, Civil society is very important. Now, as long as there are limitations, incidentally, not only in Israel, basically in all European countries, regarding the ability to demonstrate, then cyber would become more and more important. But again, the model of adaptation to emergencies is challenging, and you have costs. And I think that what this pandemic should teach us, I mean, there are many lessons from that pandemic, obviously, it's a different debate, but one of the lessons is never assume rationalities as taken for granted, and we have to become friendly with unexpected life and with uncertainty. You know, in a way, after the end of the Cold War, we were embedded in a sense that our life are quite clear. We can take a flight everywhere. Basically, life is relatively convenient. We have ignored abusive treatment of environment, socioeconomic stratification, and then the virus came, and probably it wouldn't take place without us, humanity, abusive of the environment. So I would argue that our life after the pandemic is over might be very different. And I think that we have to conceptualize our life in the future, including in law and society, as much less expected and much more uncertain.
Thank you very much, Sylvia and Gadi. Our time is running off, but we have one last intervention from the audience, and my General Secret Service capabilities hint that it might be Malcolm Philly from Berkeley.
Hi, everyone. Gadi, thank you very much.
Hi, Malcolm.
I was surprised that you didn't have another model, and that was the communitarian model.
Yeah.
Seemed to me that Etzioni might very well have been added into here, and this may be speaking from bucolic Berkeley or California, but it seems to me that the public has widely embraced the various restrictions that we have here, and that various sorts of the complaints that are articulated are really genuine, namely that the costs and the benefits of the constraints are not evenly distributed. I've been trying to get a lot of people out of prison with no avail, and the courts have been ineffective, jail and prison. Nursing homes are terrible, and lots of people are not like me on a fixed income, or us on a fixed income, but have lost their sources of income. And the pandemic has underscored the failure of the modern administrative state to have a strong, at least here in the United States, to have a strong safety net. And one hopes that will be one of the lessons that will be learned from the pandemic. And I'm more concerned about those than the fact that we may all be required to carry face masks around with us, or go through additional hurdles as we go through airports and things. So your comment on that?
Okay, no, I fully agree. You know, I'm quite skewed by communities and law. So
right.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that you know, if you look at different settings, like governors of Connecticut, Virginia, and New York, obviously, who are challenging Trump. So this is not communitarianism, but this is, as you say, challenging central foci of power from below the federal system in the case of federalism. In Israel, you have a gradual, I wouldn't say revolt, but certainly resistance by municipalities who are saying, give us more power. And you know, a book by, for example, the research of Sunstein about moving more to expert communities. I think that this is an important vein to go through, and how communities may find solutions which federal governments, state governments cannot find. On that, I would add also the issue of communities as a source of support, namely that communities might be much better in offering a psychological support in times of distress. Now, all of it obviously would have to find legal solutions, because in some countries, the legal ability of communities and municipalities to be part of the struggle would demand some legal reforms and would demand some regulatory reforms. But I fully agree that I should add to the paper or lecture a perspective of communitarianism or communities as a source of redemption. Thanks very much, Malcolm.
Thank you, Malcolm. We are already reaching the end of our time, but Robert Neufeld, very quick comment or question, and Gadi, very quick response.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for a very illuminating lecture, Gadi. And after listening for the interesting comments later, I thought of having one short comment about the issue of certainty. The way I see it, I believe that certainty is, in a way, a myth. Not only it's clear in these days, but it's usually so. It reminded me of writings of CLS writing, of critical legal studies writings, like Marty Koskineni on the role of law, what law is, saying one quote I remember is that law is nothing but an attempt to project a stable relationship between spheres it creates to divide between concreteness and normativity, and the rule of law is always some kind of a compromise between individualism and sovereignty. So what we are seeing in many ways is what usually is the situation. It's more like an extreme case that things are more clear, but the way I see it, it's nothing more than a projection of what we are seeing, what we should be expecting from law, from institutions all of the time. That's the short comment I had.
No, I thanks for that. No, I agree. I mean, first of all, since the 16th century, maybe till realism, certainly legal certainty prevailed. But even afterwards, still most of our legal paradigms and socio-legal paradigms are assuming, or at least not sufficiently challenging, the issue of legal uncertainty. And this has been the main point in my talk, that we have to become conceptually, epistemologically speaking, much more friendly with concepts of uncertainty as part of law and society. And I will end with the end of the talk that I think that this pandemic may change our epistemology and the way in which we think about legal certainty. We have to become much more critical. So, the good news about that pandemic is it has changed our life, not necessarily for good, but at least we can have some lessons about how we conceptualize some parts of law and society.
Thank you very much, Gadi. This crisis will change many paradigms, shift many paradigms. At least it will be interesting times. Professor Gad Barzilai, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank
very much.
Participants also on Facebook. And I want to tell you that if you want to participate in the next talks and seminars, webinars at the Minerva Center, please take a look either at our website or Facebook. I wish you a healthy, safe, and nice week. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks.